Greetings, my young friends. I'm recording this on Thursday evening, the Thursday of the day that we did not have class. I thought I'd just check in with you, do a little video on some of what was in your reading for today from Jonathan Salgado. Just some things I want to highlight for your consideration. I like on page 47, basically he says right above the paragraph break, the primary basic creativity calls us back to the question, how can we hear more from that text than what we already know? In other words, rather than finding a text that will somehow be a little framework on which we'll hang an idea or several ideas that we already think are correct and true, and in fact may well be, and maybe even put it into a nice 3-point outline with an alliteration and everything. But is that the creativity really called for, which is the creativity of listening deeply to the text and allowing it to encounter us, such that on the top of 48, he talks about the more basic creativity, which denotes the appearance of the new rather than, well, we know these things are true and let's see if we can't make it into a nice outline and so on. So he criticizes the idea of preachers not doing this kind of creative listening to the text, of course. I like on 52, he says that apart from this kind of attention to a biblical passage and its context, we're liable to two errors. First, this approach easily forgets the detailed richness of the text that it had hoped to contain and to summarize, but it forgets the detailed richness. And I think the second is, and it risks, in its drive toward a universally true pronouncement, missing the specific truth claim made in the text. I think that's really good. So that in the next page on 53, just one line, the use of generalizations and abstractions in sermon themes should be avoided. Yeah. Why does the sermon have 3 points? Are there 3 of anything in the text? Sometimes there are. And those are always handy, but it's not always that way, of course. On 55, one thing I want to highlight, and I would actually say this to him, and I may, when Jonathan comes back to be with us on next Thursday. He talks about conventional homiletics, has it that a sermon needs 3 points, and it's even better if they're stated alliteratively, the same letter. You knew that. But at the end of that paragraph, this is on 55, he says, public worship, he's kind of commenting on a sermon he must have heard at one point, contains praise, prayer, and preaching. Those would be the 3 points, and they are alliterative points. We all know that, he says, but the farther homiletics leads the preacher, the farther we get from what's going on in the text. There is no praise, nor prayer, nor preaching in the text. I think he's still talking about that story of David in the Old Testament that we may have to look at more carefully at some point. Now, in fact, next week. What troubles me a little bit is that his use of the word homiletics here. The farther that homiletics leads the preacher, homiletics, of course, having to do with preaching, that's what it is. It's sort of the art and science of preaching. But the farther that homiletics leads the preacher, I guess rather than hermeneutics, rather than biblical interpretation, the farther we get from what's going on in the text. I think he would agree that this is not a good use of the word homiletics. as though the term homiletics, sort of in and of itself, implies a kind of sermonizing that leads you away from the text and more into things like, let's have a 3-point sermon with, same letter for each point. That's not homiletics. In fact, this book is homiletics. So it's and it is in a very good way. It's like trying to examine what is preaching, and here, of course, specifically Christian and biblical preaching. So it's not a matter of homiletics leading a preacher farther and thus farther away from the text. That would just be bad sermon preparation. But homiletics is the art and science that would say that's bad sermon preparation. I hope you get my point. I think he used homiletics like that maybe one other time. He kind of uses the word homiletical like that at the end of this little chapter too. I think I want to highlight something at the bottom of 56. I think we need to read it this way. The text, that is the biblical text, evokes human experience and emotion, inviting our identification with a slice of life which could speak of our own experience. So that's the ideal of the text. Then that's being contrasted with the next sentence. The sermon's shape and movement, and of course, in this case, a bad sermon, evoke a cool embrace, should be a comma there, a teaching we have already granted is true before we even heard the sermon. So, if I ever do get around to being a sort of a copy editor for Jonathan on this, it was written in Spanish first, translated into English, and anyhow, if one can see that there's a strong contrast being drawn there between how a biblical text ideally functions and then how often sermons seem to move us away from that kind of function, and I think that's an important point. Moving on into the next chapter about the new hermeneutic, which certainly, as he says, isn't really new, and it's definitely not new anymore. And, I'm aware of the phrase. I don't know if I ever had a really good idea about what the new hermeneutic really entailed, that language. Probably other than this, and he talks about it in this chapter. It would be an approach to Scripture in which, in fact, we're trying to remind ourselves consistently that the biblical text, is a subject, that it addresses us, that we can be the objects of divine address through the Bible. It doesn't automatically happen. It doesn't always happen, but when we are reading the text most genuinely, and he talks about what that would imply, we realize that we are ourselves being addressed. That's part of the idea of the new hermeneutic, I think. And I like what he says there on 62 then, that the text is also working on the sermon, and I think this must be part of the new hermeneutic. In the things that I do and think, bottom of 61, in putting a sermon together, the text is also working on the sermon. Next paragraph, rather, honestly encountering a biblical text often means a creative confrontation with a powerful, moving reality which has its own ideas about the outcome of our partnership's work toward a sermon. Well, not literally its own ideas, but I think we get the idea, what he's getting at. He then illustrates that with Psalm 19. I don't think this was particularly clear, but his point's a nice one. One could quote from Psalm 19, and he's probably heard sermons like this, um, where it's sort of like, well, this is an argument for the existence of God, and then in the sermon, one would go on to talk about many sensitive and learned persons who have believed in God and have benefited by their belief in God. But Jonathan is right to say the psalmist is not here or anywhere in Scripture arguing the case for God's existence. In the Bible, God's reality is simply assumed. So, whatever that text is trying to say to the preacher, and through the preacher to us, it's not heard. After we've listened to this sermon, we still don't know what Psalm 19 is trying to tell us. There are a lot of sermons that kind of limp along in that way, aren't there? And I think he's making a lot of the same kind of ideas, or this is kind of the general claim. I do want to go to page 67 and do this quickly. Point number 2, I-it attitudes, and this is derived from Martin Buber, the Jewish philosopher, and his categories of I-you and I-it. I-it attitudes toward the biblical text lead us logically to assume that we, the human, rational, sensitive, adaptive elements in the encounter, are to be the actors, the appliers, the users of it, the text. And of course, the whole idea here is, again, to encounter the text less as an it and more as a subject, a you that's speaking to us, addressing us. Bottom of 68, a part of this problem arises from the truth claims we make for the Scriptures. Truth is so easily understood to be fixed principle. And I think it's very easy to assume this about the Bible. Objectively real dicta, or that's the plural of dictum, which would mean a saying. Objectively real sayings about life over against we are the variable, changing, transitory, and therefore the actors who understand and react to truth, either rightly or wrongly. We are then treating the Bible as an inert object. Maybe we could say like a book of propositions. This so easily leads to people saying things like, the Bible is timeless truths. I love that he's pushing back against that. There's nothing about the Bible that is timeless. It sounds religious, it sounds spiritual, but it's not taking seriously that we are timeful creatures in history, in a reality that is timeful, and that the Bible testifies to a God who dwells and acts timefully, whatever else you might want to say about God in relationship to time. It's not that in the Bible we get a deposit of timeless truths that we then go dig in and unearth and then present to people. We're proclaiming the biblical witness to God's presence and activity in the world, most specifically, certainly in the Old Testament, in Israel, the people of Israel. And then, of course, in the New Testament proclamation, it's in the person of Jesus. But this is not timeless. In fact, to use the language of Galatians, it's in the fullness of time. It's time full. And that's the nature of Scripture. I think I pretty much got to where, I should have had you go to page 73, of course, to the end of this, but he has some good stuff there. I'll close with this last paragraph, 73. We've been talking about violating the integrity of the text by means of attitudes and activities in sermon construction which forget that the text is a partner, active and pregnant with promise as our with as much promise as our fertile imaginations, and that it has as much to say as we do about the sermon subject, aim, and content. Interesting stuff. Again, probably my biggest sort of critique or warning is his kind of implied use of homiletics that would lead us to think that it's somehow unhelpful or dangerous moves that a preacher does in constructing sermons, when in fact homiletics would be, as we learn good homiletical theory, like say from this book, we can actually detect, what's bad homiletics, what's bad preaching, or at least we'll say what's less faithful and effective preaching. All right. Thanks a lot. I'd like for you to respond to this with notes. So do some note taking on this, especially if you have questions that arise from anything I've said, and we can tackle it on next week. Blessings, love to you all. Let's see if I hit this button.